The sound of rain lightly tapping against the grand windows of Sterling Manor filled the quiet corridors, blending seamlessly with the faint ticking of an antique clock. Olivia Carter had just finished dusting the bookshelves in the private study when a deep, authoritative voice broke the silence. "Olivia, come here." She turned, surprised to see Nicholas Sterling standing by his desk, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her with an expression unreadable yet commanding. Nicholas was a man of precision, a figure of calculated power. He rarely spoke to his household staff unless necessary, and certainly never in this tone. Setting aside the feather duster, Olivia stepped forward, keeping her posture straight. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" He studied her for a brief moment, his gaze assessing. Then, without preamble, he stated, "I need you to accompany me to a business dinner tonight." The words were so unexpected that Olivia almost laughed, except there was no humor in his expression. "I... I'm sorry, what?" she asked cautiously. Nicholas exhaled, as if he had no patience for repeating himself. "My investors will be there. One of them insists on bringing his wife, and it would be impolite for me to show up alone. You'll accompany me, that's all." Olivia's fingers curled slightly against her apron. "Sir, He cut her off with a slight raise of his hand. "Before you misunderstand, let me be clear. I don't need conversation or opinions from you. Just be present, act appropriately, and don't interfere." His words carried the weight of command, leaving no room for negotiation. But Olivia had never been the kind to accept orders without question. She lifted her chin slightly. "And why me?" For the first time, Nicholas hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then his voice returned to its usual cool detachment. "Because you're convenient. You work for me, and I don't have the time or patience to seek out someone else." A bitter realization settled over Olivia. He didn't see her as a person, just a quick solution to an inconvenience. A few weeks ago, she might have simply nodded and obeyed. But something in her had changed recently. Maybe it was the exhaustion of years of being overlooked, underestimated. Maybe it was the knowledge that a single night could be an opportunity to be more than just an invisible presence in someone else's world. So instead of the meek agreement Nicholas likely expected, Olivia met his gaze and replied, "Fine, I'll go." If he was surprised by her lack of hesitation, he didn't show it. He merely nodded and added, "My driver will take you shopping for something suitable. Be ready by 7. With that, he dismissed her, returning his attention to the papers scattered across his desk. Olivia turned and walked out of the study, but her mind was already racing ahead. If Nicholas thought she would simply sit there like a well-dressed shadow, he was about to be very, very wrong. The evening arrived quicker than Olivia had anticipated. As she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the sleek navy blue dress she had been given, a strange sense of transformation settled over her. Gone was the simple housekeeper in a uniform of modest fabrics and practicality. In her place stood a woman she barely recognized. Her long, dark hair, usually tied in a quick bun, now cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders. Her skin, once bare of any enhancements, glowed subtly with makeup that accentuated the quiet strength in her eyes. She wasn't sure who this version of herself was, but tonight she would find out. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the estate, its presence a reminder of the stark divide between Olivia's world and Nicholas's. The driver opened the door for her, and she stepped inside, the scent of expensive leather and faint cologne filling the enclosed space. When they arrived at the grand entrance of the restaurant, Olivia spotted Nicholas waiting just outside. He looked as effortlessly composed as ever, his black suit tailored to perfection, his presence radiating an air of control. His gaze flickered over her, taking in the transformation, but he said nothing except a curt, "Let's go." As they stepped into the restaurant, all eyes seemed to turn toward them. The room was filled with power, men and women dressed in wealth, their conversations a quiet hum of influence. Olivia had been in this world before, but only as someone clearing away glasses, tidying up after those who rarely acknowledged her presence. Not tonight. Nicholas led her toward an exclusive table in the center, where a group of elite businessmen and their impeccably dressed companions were already seated. One of them, a distinguished older man with an air of quiet authority, lifted an eyebrow at Olivia. "Nicholas," he greeted, extending a hand. "And this is?" Nicholas barely spared her a glance. "Olivia Carter. She's with me tonight." That was all. No title, no introduction of who she was. Just that she was with him, as though she were a temporary fixture. Nothing more. The older man exchanged a glance with another investor. Olivia saw it. The subtle flicker of judgment, the quiet assessment that she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time in her life she had been made to feel like an outsider. But tonight, she refused to shrink. Dinner began, and as expected, the conversation revolved around high-stake negotiations, stock values, and aggressive market expansions. Olivia remained silent, her gaze flicking between the men as she absorbed every detail. Then, a sharp voice cut through the chatter. "So, Miss Carter," one of the investors, Mr. Calloway, turned to her with an amused smirk. "Tell me, do you find all this talk about billions and acquisitions exciting, or are you completely lost?" It was a question meant to put her in her place. Olivia could feel Nicholas tense beside her, as if bracing for embarrassment. But instead of looking flustered, she smiled, calm and poised. "Actually," she said, "I find it fascinating." The investor's smirk faltered. She continued smoothly. "Understanding business isn't just about numbers. It's about people. After all, behind every stock price, there are employees, consumers, and communities. Isn't the real challenge ensuring success while also benefiting those who make that success possible?" A brief silence stretched across the table. Victoria Langford, the only female investor at the table, leaned forward with sudden interest. "That's an interesting perspective. Tell me, Olivia, what would you say is the biggest mistake most businesses make when trying to expand?" Nicholas shot Olivia a look, one that clearly said, "Don't answer that." But Olivia did. "Short-term thinking," she replied, "expanding too fast without considering sustainability. True success isn't just about reaching the top, it's about staying there." Victoria smiled, impressed. "I like her, Nicholas. She's got a brain." Nicholas's expression was unreadable, but Olivia could feel the tension radiating from him. She had done something he never expected. She had made herself impossible to ignore. And for the first time in years, Olivia Carter felt powerful. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations, the clinking of fine crystal against porcelain punctuating the air. Olivia could feel the weight of Nicholas's gaze on her, though he said nothing. His investors, however, were no longer ignoring her presence. Mr. Calloway, the man who had initially dismissed her, leaned back in his chair with an intrigued smirk. "Short-term thinking, you say? And what would you suggest as a sustainable approach, Miss Carter? There was a challenge in his tone, a test to see if her previous response had been luck or something more. Olivia didn't hesitate. Strategic patience. It's not about how quickly you grow, but how well you manage growth. If a company expands too aggressively, it risks overextending resources, losing control of quality, and alienating its customer base. The best leaders know when to push forward and when to hold back. Victoria Langford, the sharp-eyed businesswoman at the table, let out a short laugh. You should be in the boardroom, Olivia. That's better advice than half the consultants we hire. Nicholas remained silent, but Olivia could feel the tension in his posture. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. She was supposed to be an accessory, a silent presence. Instead, she was holding her own in a room full of power brokers. The waiter arrived with a bottle of rare red wine, carefully pouring for each guest. As Olivia reached for her glass, Nicholas leaned in slightly, his voice low and controlled. "What do you think you're doing?" She turned her head, just enough to meet his gaze. "Having a conversation." His jaw tightened. "That's not what you were brought here to do." Olivia set her glass down deliberately. "Then maybe you shouldn't have brought me here at all." For the first time since she had known him, Nicholas Sterling had no immediate response. The conversation at the table moved on, shifting toward an upcoming merger that was causing a stir in the industry. Olivia listened intently, absorbing every word. She might not have had a business degree, but years of working in the Sterling estate had given her a front-row seat to the corporate world. She had overheard countless discussions, read the discarded financial reports left in Nicholas's office, and understood more than he or anyone else ever assumed. At one point, Victoria turned back to Olivia. "What's your background, dear? I don't recall seeing you at any of these events before." Olivia met her gaze without hesitation. "I work for Mr. Sterling." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "Work for him? In what capacity?" Before Olivia could answer, Nicholas cut in. "She's my housekeeper." The words dropped like a stone into the conversation. A flicker of surprise crossed the investors' faces. Even Victoria, who had seemed amused by Olivia's insights, straightened in her seat. Mr. Calloway let out a slow chuckle. "Well, that's certainly unexpected." There it was, the judgment, the unspoken belief that she didn't belong here. Olivia took a sip of her wine and then, with quiet confidence, replied, "Yes, I manage Mr. Sterling's household, and over the years, I've learned that the same principles that apply to running a business apply to running a home. Budgeting, crisis management, problem solving. I may not sit in a boardroom, but I understand leadership, efficiency, and, most importantly, people." A beat of silence. Then Victoria laughed, genuinely entertained. "I like you, Olivia." Nicholas, however, looked like he wanted to overturn the table. The dinner eventually wound down, and as the guests rose to leave, Olivia felt Nicholas's hand on her lower back, guiding her toward the exit with a firm grip. It wasn't an affectionate touch. It was one of control. The moment they stepped outside, away from the watchful eyes of his investors, Nicholas turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his voice low but sharp. "What the hell was that?" Olivia crossed her arms. "I don't know, Nicholas. What was that?" "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like your investors were actually interested in what I had to say." His jaw clenched. "You were supposed to sit there and be quiet." Instead, you turned the entire evening into a spectacle. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You're upset because I spoke, or because they listened? A muscle in his jaw twitched. He didn't answer. Olivia let the silence stretch between them. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she turned and stepped into the waiting car. For the first time in years, she had disrupted Nicholas Sterling's perfectly controlled world, and she wasn't sorry about it. The car ride back to Nicholas Sterling's penthouse was steeped in silence. Olivia sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the passing city lights. Nicholas sat beside her, one hand gripping his jaw, the other clenched into a fist against his thigh. She had seen him angry before, frustrated, impatient, irritated. But this was different. This wasn't the typical outburst she had witnessed when his staff failed to meet his impossible standards. No, this was something more controlled, more restrained, like a man who had just realized he had lost control of something he never thought he would. When they finally reached the penthouse, Nicholas didn't wait for the driver to open the door. He stepped out sharply, his every movement clipped and precise. Olivia followed at her own pace, knowing that whatever storm was brewing inside him would be unleashed the moment they were alone. The elevator ride up was suffocating. Nicholas didn't look at her. His jaw was still tight, his gaze fixed on the glowing numbers indicating each passing floor. When the doors opened to his grand, sprawling penthouse, he walked in first, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair. Then, at last, he turned to her. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was quiet, but the force behind it was unmistakable. Olivia stepped inside, taking her time. She had spent years navigating Nicholas's moods, learning when to hold back and when to push forward. "I was thinking," she said calmly, "that someone needed to challenge you." His eyes darkened. "That was not your place." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You keep saying that. Your place. As if I should have just sat there like a decoration while you perform for your investors. That's exactly what you should have done." His voice was ice. Olivia tilted her head, unshaken. "And yet, they listened to me. They respected what I had to say." Nicholas let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "They were amused. That's all. You were a novelty, something unexpected at the table. But don't mistake that for respect." Olivia's expression didn't waver. "Respect is earned, Nicholas, and I think I started earning it tonight." A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Or something deeper? Something he wasn't ready to admit. He turned away, pacing toward the bar. He poured himself a drink with more force than necessary, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. Olivia watched him, waiting. "You humiliated me," he muttered, taking a long sip. "No," Olivia corrected gently. "I forced you to see something you didn't want to." Nicholas turned, leaning against the bar, studying her. She met his gaze without flinching. "For years," she continued, "you've surrounded yourself with people who agree with you. People who tell you what you want to hear because they're afraid of losing your favor. But tonight, for the first time, someone at that table saw you differently. And it wasn't because of you. It was because of me." The words hung in the air between them, thick with truth. Nicholas's grip tightened around his glass. "You're playing a dangerous game, Olivia." She smiled faintly. "And what's the worst that could happen? You fire me, A tense silence stretched between them. She had challenged him. She had questioned his authority in a way no one had before, and he hated that. But what Olivia saw, the thing Nicholas would never say out loud, was that he also respected it. For the first time, Nicholas Sterling had met someone he couldn't control, and that terrified him. Nicholas had always prided himself on control. He controlled his business, his image, and the people around him with precision. But tonight, standing in his penthouse across from Olivia, he felt something shift, and he hated it. She wasn't like the investors who nodded along to his every word. She wasn't like the assistants who scrambled to meet his demands. She wasn't even like the women he occasionally entertained, women who knew better than to challenge him. Olivia had defied him. Spoken in a room where she was supposed to be invisible, and had done so with such quiet confidence that it made him uneasy. She had changed the course of the night, and perhaps something much bigger. Nicholas set his drink down on the marble counter, the sound breaking the silence. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. Olivia didn't move. She stood her ground, her posture steady, her chin slightly lifted. "I think I understand something you don't." His lips curled into a humorless smile. "Enlighten me." She took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering. "You believe power is about control, about making people listen to you, respect you through intimidation or wealth. But real power? It's about influence. It's about connection. You don't have that, Nicholas. You have fear. And fear fades." His jaw tightened. No one had ever spoken to him like this. But what unsettled him the most wasn't her defiance. It was the fact that she wasn't wrong. For a moment, he studied her, searching for a sign of hesitation. But there was none. Olivia wasn't speaking to him as his housekeeper. She was speaking to him as an equal, and he had no idea what to do with that. Nicholas exhaled sharply, pushing off the counter and walking past her toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. He placed his hands in his pockets, staring out at the city he had built his empire within. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, composed, unreadable, but inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. "You believe you changed something tonight?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I don't believe it. I know it," Olivia responded. He turned, facing her once more. "And what? You think that makes you indispensable?" Olivia let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "I don't care about being indispensable. I care about being heard." Her words landed like a challenge. Nicholas tilted his head slightly, regarding her with a look she couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of frustration, intrigue, and something else. Something darker, something dangerous. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "All right, Olivia," he said, stepping closer, his presence imposing but no longer threatening. "You want to be heard? Fine. Let's see if you can handle what comes next." She didn't back away. "I can handle more than you think." Nicholas chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." The tension between them was no longer just conflict. It was something else entirely. A shift in power. A challenge issued and accepted. And neither of them had any intention of backing down. Nicholas had always dictated the terms of his world. Every deal, every conversation, every relationship was on his terms. But after last night, for the first time in years, He felt as if he had lost control of something, and that something was Olivia. As he sat in his office the next morning, overlooking the city that once felt like it belonged to him, he found himself replaying the events of the dinner. The way Olivia had spoken, calm, self-assured, unshaken by the judgment around her, had unsettled him. He had expected her to be silent, to serve only as a placeholder, an accessory to a carefully curated image. Instead, she had challenged him. And worse, she had done it in a way that made the investors listen. Nicholas had never been the type to dwell on a moment. But this was different. Olivia was different. And that irritated him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. The door opened, and Olivia stepped inside, carrying herself with that same quiet confidence that had infuriated him the night before. She was back in her usual attire, simple but professional, as if last night had never happened. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice even. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "Sit." She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and lowering herself into the chair across from him. He tapped his fingers against his desk. "You made quite the impression last night." Her gaze remained steady. Was that a compliment or a reprimand? He smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "That depends. Are you going to start thinking you're more important than you are?" Olivia didn't flinch. "I don't need to think it. I know my worth." His smirk faded. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as an employee, not as an inconvenience, but as a force all her own. There was no arrogance in her words, only certainty. She knew exactly who she was, and that was something Nicholas had never encountered in someone he hadn't already deemed useful. "You caught Lewis's attention," he said, studying her reaction. She nodded, waiting for him to continue. "He called this morning," Nicholas went on. "Said he was impressed. Said he saw potential in you." Something flickered in Olivia's expression, but she said nothing. Nicholas leaned forward. "I don't like surprises, Olivia." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Then maybe you should stop underestimating people." He exhaled slowly, something tightening in his chest. She was right, and he hated that. The silence stretched between them, charged with an energy neither of them fully understood. Nicholas tapped his fingers on the desk again before finally speaking. "I have a proposition for you." Olivia raised an eyebrow, waiting. "If Lewis thinks you have potential, I want to see if he's right. I want you to sit in on my next investor meeting. Listen, learn, speak when spoken to." She tilted her head slightly. "And what do I get out of this?" Nicholas smiled, slow and calculating. "A chance." "A chance at what?" He let the words hang between them before replying, to prove that last night wasn't just luck. Olivia considered him carefully. She knew there was more to this than he was saying. Nicholas didn't offer things without reason. He didn't do favors. If he was bringing her in, it was because he wanted something. But she wasn't about to turn down an opportunity that she had fought to create for herself. After a long moment, she nodded. "Fine. But if you think I'm going to be another silent observer, you clearly weren't paying attention last night." Nicholas chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I was paying attention, Olivia, more than you realize." She stood, her posture poised. "Then I guess we'll see if you're ready for what comes next." And with that, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving Nicholas staring after her, more intrigued than he had been in a very long time. Olivia sat in the sleek glass-walled conference room, the hum of low conversation filling the space as the investors settled in. The room reeked of power, of men who had built empires, of calculated decisions that shaped industries, of fortunes made and lost with the stroke of a pen. It was the kind of room Nicholas thrived in. And now, for the first time, she was in it too. Nicholas sat at the head of the table, composed, exuding effortless authority. He hadn't spoken much to Olivia since their conversation in his office. He had merely given her the time and location of the meeting and expected her to show up. No instructions, no warnings. It was a test, a way for him to see if she could keep up. She wouldn't just keep up. She would thrive. The meeting began, and Olivia watched as Nicholas took command of the room. His voice was smooth, authoritative, the kind that demanded attention without needing to raise in volume. He presented figures with precision, his strategy for expansion laid out in flawless detail. The investors nodded along, some taking notes, some merely watching, calculating. Then came the moment Olivia had been waiting for. Louis, the same investor who had challenged her at the dinner, leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Nicholas, your numbers look solid, but your plan hinges on aggressive expansion. Have you considered the risk factors? The market is shifting. Pouring money into growth without ensuring long-term sustainability could be a dangerous move." Nicholas barely hesitated. "Risk and reward go hand in hand, Louis. You don't build an empire by playing it safe." A few of the investors murmured in agreement, but Olivia saw it, the subtle hesitation in Louis's expression. So she spoke. "I think the real question," Olivia said, her voice measured yet firm, "is whether this expansion is built on a foundation strong enough to support it. Growth is essential, but if a company ignores the importance of sustainable infrastructure, rapid expansion can lead to collapse." The room fell silent. Nicholas turned his head slightly, his sharp gaze locking onto Olivia. Louis, however, looked intrigued. "Interesting point, Miss Olivia," he said. "And what do you propose instead?" Olivia didn't hesitate. A balanced approach. Prioritize reinvesting in internal structures, employees, technology, community relations, so that when expansion does happen, it's not just rapid, but sustainable. Growth should be about more than just numbers. It should be about longevity. Louis chuckled, nodding. "Smart. It's rare to hear that kind of perspective in a room like this." Some of the other investors nodded along, considering her words. Nicholas, however, remained silent. He let the conversation continue, shifting it back to his strategies, smoothly redirecting attention. But Olivia knew what had happened. She had just stepped into his arena and held her own. And she had done it in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to him. When the meeting ended, the investors filed out, murmuring among themselves. Louis gave Olivia a nod of approval before leaving. Nicholas, however, stayed seated, watching her. She met his gaze head on. "You were supposed to observe," he said finally, his voice unreadable. "I did," she replied, lifting her chin. "And I spoke when it mattered." He studied her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a low chuckle and stood. "You keep this up, Olivia," he said as he walked past her, "and you're going to become a problem." She smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. Good. Then I'm exactly where I want to be. Nicholas didn't respond. He just walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, victorious. Nicholas walked into the conference room, his mind still clouded with thoughts of Olivia. The room was already full. The investors sat in a half circle, their expressions unreadable, their eyes trained on him as he took his seat at the head of the table. Olivia had taken a seat further down, an observer once again, though she no longer blended into the background, not after today. Mr. Donovan, the most influential of the investors, leaned forward. Nicholas, I'll be direct. Your company is standing at a crossroads. Today's discussion showed us two possible paths. One is the one you've always taken: aggressive expansion, high-risk strategies. The other is what Olivia suggested: a balanced, sustainable approach with long-term stability. Nicholas clasped his hands together, keeping his expression neutral. I appreciate the perspective, but risk is what keeps us ahead of our competitors. Playing it safe isn't always the answer. Donovan raised an eyebrow, and yet some of the biggest corporations in history have collapsed because their leaders refuse to adapt. You're brilliant, Nicholas, but you're stubborn. That could be your downfall. The word stung more than he expected. He had spent his entire career proving people wrong. But now the doubt wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the very people who had supported him from the beginning. Another investor, Mrs. Holloway, spoke next. Nicholas, we need a plan that reassures us. Right now, your leadership feels volatile. And today, Olivia demonstrated something that has been missing: foresight. Nicholas turned his gaze to Olivia, who sat with her hands folded on the table. She hadn't expected to be addressed so directly, but she didn't waver. I didn't come here to undermine Nicholas, she said evenly. I came to show that the company can be stronger. Everything he's built is impressive, but the future isn't about just being impressive. It's about being sustainable. Nicholas clenched his jaw. The investors were eating up every word she said. He had walked into this room as the man in control, and now he felt as if he were being subtly pushed aside. Donovan exhaled, looking between them. Here's our proposal, Nicholas. We want Olivia to work alongside you in a leadership role. You need balance, and she provides it. This isn't a request. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nicholas felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. He had built this company from the ground up, and now he was being told he needed a guide, someone to steady the ship that he had captained alone for years. And worse, it was her. Olivia finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. But he knew her well enough now to recognize that she was waiting to see how he would react. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to put her in her place, to prove that he didn't need help. But beneath that, something deeper, something more honest, whispered a different truth. Maybe he did. Nicholas sat alone in his office long after everyone had left. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the city skyline casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. He loosened his tie and leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The investors had made their decision. Olivia would have a voice in the company, whether he liked it or not. It should have infuriated him. This was his company, his empire, built through years of relentless effort. He had fought through losses, betrayals, and sleepless nights to get here. And now, the investors had placed their faith in someone who, only months ago, had been cleaning his floors. But the anger he expected never came. Instead, there was something else, something unsettling, a realization. He had been losing control long before Olivia stepped into that boardroom. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He knew it was her before she even spoke. "Are you planning on sitting in the dark all night?" Olivia's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet insistence that he acknowledge what had happened. Nicholas sighed and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, her presence steady and composed, as if she belonged there, as if she had always belonged there. "You didn't say anything when the investors announced their decision," she said, crossing her arms. "Are you going to fight it?" He studied her for a long moment. Would it make a difference? No. A bitter chuckle escaped him. Of course not. She leaned against the edge of his desk, her eyes never leaving his. "This isn't about winning or losing, Nicholas. You see it that way because it's the only way you've ever known how to survive. But leadership isn't about control. It's about direction, about purpose. This company needs more than just power. It needs vision. And you think that vision is you?" His voice was sharp, but it lacked the conviction it once held. She shook her head. "I think it's us. If you'd stop fighting long enough to see it." That was what unsettled him the most. Her certainty. She wasn't here to tear him down, to steal what he had built. She wasn't his enemy. But that was the problem, wasn't it? If she wasn't an enemy, then what was she? He stood up, walking toward the window, staring out at the city below. "You know, when I first asked you to come to that dinner, I didn't even see you as a person. You were just a convenience." She didn't flinch, didn't look offended. "I know." The honesty in her voice made him turn to face her. "And now?" She met his gaze, unshaken. "Now, you don't know what to do with me." He wanted to deny it. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, but she wasn't. He had spent his life believing that power meant control, that leadership meant standing alone at the top. Olivia had walked into his world and, without trying, had dismantled every belief he had held onto for years. And the most frustrating part? He wasn't sure he wanted to put those beliefs back together. A tense silence stretched between them before Olivia finally spoke again. "This company, your company, can be something more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It can have meaning. It can actually matter to people beyond the investors. But it can't do that if its leader is too afraid to see past his own pride." His jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid." She studied him for a long moment before saying, "Then prove it." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder, offering him the smallest hint of a smile. "I'll see you in the morning, Nicholas." And then she was gone. He stood there, staring at the space she had just occupied, feeling something shift deep inside him, something he wasn't sure he could ever undo. Nicholas arrived at the office earlier than usual, the city still shaking off the quiet of dawn. He had barely slept, his mind replaying Olivia's words over and over again. Then prove it. It was such a simple challenge, but it carried the weight of everything he had built and everything he had ignored. As he stepped into the conference room, he found Olivia already there, reviewing notes for their upcoming meeting with the investors. She barely acknowledged him at first, as if she expected nothing more than the same resistance he had given her before. "I want to restructure our approach," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I mean that I've spent too much time thinking about how to keep control instead of thinking about what's actually best for the company. I want to change that." Olivia studied him carefully, searching for signs of hesitation, of doubt. "And what exactly are you proposing?" He walked to the window, staring out at the skyline that had once symbolized everything he had worked for. Now, it felt like a reflection of the walls he had built around himself. "You said this company could be more than just numbers on a balance sheet," he said, turning to face her. "I want to see what that looks like." For the first time in days, something softened in her gaze. "You're serious?" "Yes." A slow smile curved her lips. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of late nights and intense discussions. Olivia and Nicholas worked side by side, reevaluating their approach to leadership, reshaping the company's future in a way that neither of them had anticipated. For Nicholas, the process was unnerving. He was used to making decisions alone, dictating orders without challenge. But Olivia refused to let him fall back into old habits. Every time he tried to take full control, she pushed back, forcing him to see things from perspectives he had ignored for years. At first, it was frustrating, but then it became something else. It became a partnership. One evening, after an exhausting day of negotiations, Nicholas leaned back in his chair, watching Olivia as she reviewed another document with her usual focus. "You know," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about the night of that business dinner." She glanced up. "Oh?" "I brought you there because I thought you'd be easy to ignore. I thought you'd sit quietly and let me control the room." Olivia smirked. "That didn't exactly go as planned, did it?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No. You spoke up. You made them listen to you. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was challenging me in a way that actually mattered." A pause settled between them, heavier than before. "You changed everything," he admitted. "And I don't know if I ever told you, but I—" She held up a hand, stopping him. "Nicholas, before you say anything, I need to know something." He leaned forward slightly. "What?" She searched his face, her expression more vulnerable than he had ever seen. "Are you doing this because you believe in it, or are you doing it for me?" The question caught him off guard. For so long, he had been certain that power and success were the only things that mattered. But now, as he looked at Olivia, he realized something that scared him more than any business deal ever had. "I don't know who I am without this company," he admitted, "but I do know that for the first time, I want to build something that means more than just profits." She held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Then that's a good start." As the night stretched on, they continued to plan, their conversation shifting between business and something unspoken that neither of them was quite ready to address. But one thing was certain: Nicholas was no longer the man he had been when this all started, and neither was Olivia. They had both changed, and maybe, just maybe, they were finally ready to face whatever came next together. Nicholas stood in front of the conference room, his hands resting on the table as he looked at the team gathered before him. The board members, once skeptical of his leadership, now watched him with a mix of expectation and curiosity. Olivia sat across from him, her expression calm but attentive, as if waiting to see if he would truly follow through on everything they had worked toward. For the first time in his career, Nicholas wasn't here to sell a vision fueled by numbers and profits. He was here to present something much bigger, something he had only begun to understand himself. He took a breath. I've spent years building this company into what I thought success should look like. And for a long time, I believed that meant controlling every decision, maximizing every opportunity, and eliminating anything that stood in the way of growth. He let his gaze travel across the room, pausing on each person. But what I failed to see, what Olivia helped me understand, is that true success isn't just about expansion or revenue. It's about the people who make that success possible. There was a brief silence before Mr. Haynes, the chairman of the board, leaned forward. "And what exactly are you proposing, Nicholas?" He glanced at Olivia, and she gave him the smallest nod of encouragement. "We're shifting our focus," Nicholas continued. "Moving forward, we're integrating social responsibility into our business model, not as a side project, not as a publicity stunt, but as a core part of who we are. That means sustainable growth, ethical partnerships, and a commitment to investing in the people who work for us." A murmur spread through the room. Some board members looked intrigued, others skeptical. Mr. Haynes folded his hands together. "This is quite the departure from your usual approach." Nicholas met his gaze directly. "It is, but I believe it's the right one." For the first time in his career, he wasn't making a pitch to impress. He wasn't trying to manipulate the outcome. He was standing by a decision because he truly believed in it. The meeting continued with discussions, debates, and inevitable resistance. Some investors questioned the long-term financial implications. Others wanted guarantees. But Nicholas stood his ground, answering each concern with conviction, not because he had all the answers, but because he was willing to find them. By the time the meeting ended, there was no immediate consensus. But there was something else, something Nicholas had never experienced before: respect. As the board members filed out, Mr. Haynes lingered. "This is the first time I've seen you fight for something other than profit, Nicholas." He studied him for a moment. "It suits you." Nicholas nodded. "Thank you." When the room was empty, he turned to Olivia. She had remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, letting him take the lead. Now, she was watching him with something close to admiration. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he corrected. She smiled. "You know, when I first started working here, I never thought I'd see this side of you." He chuckled. "Neither did I." A comfortable silence settled between them. Nicholas had never been the type to reflect on moments like this, to appreciate the journey instead of just the outcome. But with Olivia, everything felt different. She stood, gathering her notes. "So, what now?" He watched her for a moment, taking in the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength that had changed everything for him. "Now," he said, "we build something worth remembering." Over the next few months, the company transformed in ways Nicholas never could have imagined. The new initiatives gained traction, earning the respect of not just the board, but the employees and the community as well. The culture shifted. People felt valued. And for the first time, Nicholas saw his company as more than just a machine for profit. It was something meaningful. But the biggest change wasn't in the company. It was in him. He and Olivia continued working side by side, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. What had started as a challenge, a battle of wills, had become something neither of them had expected. One evening, after a long day of meetings, they found themselves alone in the office. Olivia was reviewing reports, her focus unwavering. Nicholas, however, wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about her. "You know," he said, leaning against the desk, "I used to think the only thing that mattered was winning." She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "And now?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Now, I think I'd rather build something that lasts, with the right person." A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, but then she smiled back. "That sounds like progress." He took a step closer. "You've been the best thing to happen to this company, Olivia, and to me." Her smile softened. "Nicholas, I'm not just talking about work," he admitted. "I don't know when it happened, but He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "I've spent my whole life chasing something, and I didn't even realize what I was missing until I met you." She held his gaze, searching for any hint of hesitation. But there was none. For the first time in a long time, Nicholas knew exactly what he wanted. Olivia took a step closer. "You really mean that?" He nodded. "Yeah." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then slowly, she reached for his hand. "I think," she said softly, "you're finally ready to stop chasing and start building something real." He squeezed her hand gently, his heart lighter than it had ever been. For the first time, Nicholas wasn't just looking ahead to the next big win. He was looking at the future. And for the first time, it looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Nicholas sat in his office, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the walls. He had spent years in this very space, making decisions that shaped his company, his career, and his life. But today, for the first time, he wasn't thinking about profits or market trends. He was thinking about the journey that had brought him here, the lessons he had learned, and the people who had changed him along the way. His mind drifted back to the night of that fateful business dinner, when he had arrogantly ordered Olivia to accompany him, expecting her to be nothing more than a silent presence at the table. He had underestimated her in every possible way. What he had seen as mere defiance that night turned out to be courage, intelligence, and a strength of character that he had spent his whole life missing. Life has a way of teaching lessons in the most unexpected ways. Nicholas had spent years believing that success meant control, that power came from authority, and that leadership was about making the strongest moves without looking back. But Olivia had shattered those beliefs. She had shown him that true leadership was about listening, about valuing the people who stood beside him rather than simply giving orders from above. She had challenged him, pushed him, and ultimately made him better. One of the greatest lessons Nicholas had learned was that real success isn't measured by the size of a company or the numbers on a financial report. It's measured by impact, by how many lives you touch, how many people you uplift, and how much good you bring into the world. For years, he had been so focused on chasing success that he had failed to see the people who helped build it. Olivia had made him realize that a leader isn't great because of how much power they hold, but because of how well they use that power to create change. Looking around his office now, Nicholas felt a deep sense of gratitude. The company had transformed, not just in its business model, but in its purpose. Employees no longer felt like replaceable assets. They felt valued. The company's new initiatives had helped communities, funded social projects, and given people opportunities they had never thought possible. Nicholas had once believed that vulnerability was a weakness, but now he knew that it was the foundation of real strength. His relationship with Olivia had also evolved in ways he never could have predicted. What started as a clash of wills had turned into something deeper, something real. She had been the first person in years to truly challenge him, to see through his defenses and push him towards something greater. And as he grew, so did his feelings for her. Love, he realized, wasn't about possession or control. It was about partnership, about two people bringing out the best in each other. Nicholas thought about the people who might hear his story. How many of them were stuck in their own versions of his past, chasing the wrong things, valuing the wrong measures of success. He wished someone had told him sooner that life isn't about proving yourself to the world. It's about proving to yourself that you can be better than you were yesterday. His journey had not been an easy one. Change is never easy. It requires breaking old habits, letting go of pride, and embracing discomfort. It forces you to face truths about yourself that you might not be ready to accept. But Nicholas had learned that real transformation isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions. What kind of leader do I want to be? What kind of legacy do I want to leave? What truly matters in the end? For Nicholas, the answer was clear now. Success without meaning is empty. Power without purpose is destructive. And life without connection is lonely. The things he had once prioritized, money, status, and control, now felt insignificant compared to the impact he could make and the relationships he had built. He looked out the window at the city skyline, thinking about all the people walking below, each on their own journey, each with their own lessons to learn. He wondered how many of them were like him before Olivia walked into his life. Driven, but misguided, successful, but unfulfilled. He hoped they would find their own version of Olivia, someone who would challenge them, push them, and help them see the world through a different lens. Nicholas stood up and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out. His work wasn't done. The journey never really ends because growth is a lifelong process. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He was ready to keep learning, keep evolving, and keep building something that mattered. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself reflecting on your own journey, your own choices, and your own definition of success, then let this be a reminder. You have the power to change. No matter where you are in life, no matter how many mistakes you've made, you can always choose a different path. You can always choose to be better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all of what truly matters. The journey of growth never ends, and we can't wait to share more stories with you. See you in the next